Listening Fanfiction presents Draco and the Dark Lord's Diary. But Draco will hear about this. Based on the book series Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. Narrated for you by Sierra Feast. Chapter 1. Horrible summer holidays and illegally flying cars. Draco had been home for 6 weeks, and it was more than enough time to decide that he hated the summer holidays. No, maybe hate was too weak a word. He hated Theodore Knott. He hated black pudding. He detested summer holidays. It had started with coming home and getting yelled at by his father for every offense imaginable. His still not rectified choice of friends, which never was going to be rectified, thank you very much. His breaking about 100 school rules by entering a forbidden corridor with said friends to rescue an invaluable alchemic product from the hands of the deranged maniac his father had used to follow, which, fair enough, maybe he deserved yelling for, though not for the same reasons his father had done it. His marks being not as perfect as those of a mudblood. Never mind that his marks were the second best in his whole bloody year, and that Hermione Granger was a freaking genius! And in general, from being a terrible disappointment of a son. As a consequence, his father had decided to confine his life to the manor until he had to go back to school. No meeting people, no going to watch Quidditch matches, or even going shopping at Diagon Alley with his mother. Draco was not sure what his father's aim was with this punishment. Did he think that 2 months on the manor grounds with only his parents and the house elves for company would reform him back to the proper pure-blood heir he believed him to be? If so, he was terribly mistaken. His mother, needless to say, was very much not impressed with his father's attitude. It had taken 2 days after Draco's return from school for them to break into a huge fight. Family heirlooms had been smashed against walls, most of them from his father's side of the family, and their voices had carried over all the way to Draco's bedroom, despite a whole stairway and about 10 rooms separating him from the danger zone. Ever since, his parents had been terribly cold with each other. Oh, they were not fighting anymore, alright. Instead, they were treating each other with such frozen politeness that Draco felt like shuddering every time he witnessed it. Draco was thankful that his mother sided with him rather than her husband, of course, but it wasn't very pleasant living in a house that resembled a social icebox. Then again, being the least popular student down in the Slytherin quarters, he was pretty used to it. The worst, though, far worse than anything his parents were staging at home, was that he hadn't heard from Harry all summer. Draco didn't understand. Hermione was writing to him weekly, and even Weasley had corresponded with him, but there was not so much as a note from Harry. He wasn't the only one who had not heard from him either. He treated both Hermione and Weasley with equal silence, which left Draco more than a little suspicious. No, not suspicious. He was bloody worried, that's what he was. Draco knew, of course, of the fact that Harry was not a very welcome guest in his aunt and uncle's house. It didn't take much fantasy to imagine the way he was treated from all the thoughtless comments he had made over the last year, but the longer he went without news from Harry, the more scared he was about his friend's well-being. It had gotten to the point where he was discussing an intervention with Weasley, who, for all his faults, was equally as worried as Draco. His fears culminated when, on the day of Harry's birthday, his father returned with the news that Harry had received an official warning from the Ministry of Magic for performing a hovering charm at his Muggle relative's house. Draco tuned out the lecture about his choice of friends that followed the news, instead taking his time to freak out inwardly. Harry might not set much store by the rules, but he would not be as careless as to risk expulsion from school unless it was a matter of life or death. And with those, Draco thought uncomfortably, they'd had plenty of experience by now. He wrote to Weasley that night, insisting that they needed to set something in motion to find out whether Harry was okay or not. Weasley agreed, assuring him that he was trying to talk his parents into checking on Harry, and that in case they wouldn't budge, he was working on a backup plan with the twins. Draco was not sure if he felt assured by that or not. Fred and George Weasley were infamous for wreaking havoc all over Hogwarts, and the last thing Harry would need was more trouble associated with him. Draco also tried to talk to his mother about his worries, but while she listened, she refused to get involved. "What do you imagine I do, darling?" she sighed. "Turn up at his Muggle relative's house and demand to see the boy? They'll call the Muggle auras on me, and your father would have my head. No, dear, you will have to wait until term starts. You will see him then, I'm sure. Thankfully, Draco did not have to wait that long. After all, 4 days after Harry's birthday, he finally received a letter carried by Hedwig. The snowy owl seemed overjoyed to see him, and Draco could have kissed the bird as she dropped the letter into his hands, hooting in accomplishment before joining Aquila on his perch. Draco had never been that eager to open a letter, and he practically tore into the envelope to get to it. Dear Draco, it read, sorry for making you worry. My uncle put a lock on Hedwig's cage, so I couldn't contact you. I never received any of your letters either. Believe it or not, a house elf turned up at the Dursleys' house on my birthday, asking me to stay away from Hogwarts. He said that there was a plot to make most terrible things happen, and that I would be in mortal danger if I returned. Draco held in there, reading the sentence over twice more before he closed his eyes and let out an agonized groan. Why does the freaky stuff always happen to you? He moaned into the room at large. The elf also intercepted all the letters from you guys. Apparently, he thought that if I felt that no one was missing me, I wouldn't want to go back. He also performed the hovering charm down in the living room, dropping pudding all over the wife of an important business partner of my uncle in an attempt to get me locked away. He succeeded. Ron, Fred, and George broke me out of there, and I am now with the Weasleys. Broke me out? Draco repeated out loud, making a face and looking over at Hedwig. Do I want to know? He asked her. She let out a high screech, which Draco interpreted as no. Anyways, I'm sorry if I scared you. I am fine now. How about you? Has your father been giving you a rough time? Hope to hear from you soon. Harry. P.S. We're meeting Hermione at Diagon Alley on the 19th. Maybe you could come too? Draco let himself drop onto his bed, smiling as he reread the letter, relief settling in his stomach. The whole house elf story sounded very ominous, all right. He would have to get the details of that when he saw Harry face to face. But for now, the other boys seemed safe and sound, and that was enough for Draco. Now we just needed to talk his mother into sneaking him out to Diagon Alley on the 19th, but he was sure they would find a way. Remember, his mother said tersely as they walked out onto the shopping street, and Draco craned his neck for any sign of his friends. We need to be home before your father returns from wherever he is today. If he finds out I let you go meet Potter, Weasley, and Granger... I know, Mother! Draco waved her off. It will be fine. We'll just stay for a couple of hours. He'll never know I was gone. He'd better not, she muttered. She let the subject drop, though, instead saying, I'll work my way down your list of school supplies. We'll meet back at the Leaky Cauldron at 4 o'clock, the latest. Understood? Yes, Mother. Draco nodded absent-mindedly, still looking out for a messy bob of black hair, or alternatively, lots of ginger. He ended up finding them about 5 minutes later as they all came strolling out of Gringotts. He was so happy to see them that he pulled both Harry and Hermione into a very unmanly and un-Malfoyish hug, but he was grinning too badly to feel embarrassed about the display of affection. They separated from the others then, Mr. Weasley taking Hermione's parents out for a drink, Mrs. Weasley going to buy robes with her daughter, and the brothers scattering somewhere, Draco could not care less, as they made their way over to Florian Fortescue's to buy some ice cream. They were chattering excitedly about this and that when Harry suddenly turned to Draco, announcing, By the way, Draco, I saw your father earlier at Morgan and Burke's. Draco froze mid-step, staring at Harry incredulously, a sinking feeling in his stomach. You mean he's here? He asked, an inch into his voice. At Diagon Alley? Well, I'm not sure he still is. Harry shrugged, frowning at Draco's reaction. And it was Nocturne Alley in the first place, so... Draco could have asked what the heck Harry had been doing in Nocturne Alley, but he was too shaken by the news that his father had been nearby to question his friend. Why? Asked Harry. What's wrong? He doesn't exactly know I'm here, Draco confessed with a sigh. Mother snuck me out behind his back. He would never have allowed me to meet up with you. So if he happens to see me here... He's probably gone, Harry said in an attempt to calm him. He was trying to sell artifacts that could incriminate him. He probably didn't linger. Let's hope you're right, Draco muttered, and let's hope he did not go home to find Mother and me gone either, he thought to himself. Cheer up, Harry smiled, elbowing him. Let's buy some ice cream, and then you can tell me about your summer. Not much to tell, Draco snorted. I'd much rather hear about yours. What was that about the elf? Harry then launched into the story of how the elf had appeared in his room and what exactly he had said. By the time he wrapped up, they had finished their ice cream and reached Gambol and Jape's joke shop. What was he talking about, though? Draco frowned. What kind of danger is there supposed to be waiting at Hogwarts? Dumbledore is not hiding anything new at the school, is he? He'd better not, Hermione injected, her eyes wide. I'm telling you, Nott was just playing a joke on him. Weasley shrugged. Nott? Draco repeated, frowning. Ron thinks he sent the elf to keep me from going back to school, Harry elaborated. It might be his idea of a joke, Draco conceded, frown deepening. But you said the elf acted like he was there against instructions, didn't you? Well, yes, Harry nodded, but it seems like they can't act against instructions, so... Oh, they can if they feel strongly about something, Draco corrected him. Our elves are much more loyal to my mother than my father, for example, and they will go against his direct orders if it's about her, or sometimes me. Their conversation was interrupted, though, when they ran into the twins and their Gryffindor friend at the fireworks section of the shop, and Draco was distracted from picking it up again after. As they made their way over to Flourish and Blotts later, the place was bursting with people. Gilderoy Lockhart was there to sign his new book, and Draco groaned out loud at the same moment Hermione squealed. We can actually meet him! I mean, he's written almost a whole book list! Oh, come off it, Hermione! Draco rolled his eyes. He's a phony wannabe celebrity. What do you mean, wannabe? Hermione returned, very frosty. He's very famous, isn't he? His books are bestsellers. Just because all the witches think he's pretty. Draco scoffed and received a snort of amusement from Weasley for that. He's an airhead, Hermione, I'm telling you. Don't say that too loudly, Weasley warned as they entered the shop. Mum fancies him. Draco raised his eyebrows at him, and it seemed to be one of those rare moments where they were of one mind because Weasley rolled his eyes at him in agreement. They joined the Weasleys and the Grangers, where they were standing in the crowd, both Hermione and Miss Weasley eagerly stretching to get a glimpse of Lockhart. Draco's image of the best-selling author was, if anything, cemented in stone by the events of the next half hour. Not only was he as embarrassingly self-absorbed and attention-seeking as Draco had always assumed, but he also managed to spot Harry in the crowd and abuse his friend's fame for the sake of publicity. Draco knew he'd been sneering so hard all through the impromptu photo session Harry had been roped into that his mother would have snapped at him to assume some kind of composure, but he could not help himself. The guy was unbearable, and much worse, as he had announced so pompously before he had let Harry out of his grasp, he was going to be their new defense against the dark arts teacher. Bloody brilliant! It was what happened after, though, that actually took the cake. Harry had just been shoving the books Lockhart had gifted him into the cauldron Weasley's little sister was holding when a steely voice made them turn around in surprise. And Red, from Draco's side. Harry Potter, what a pleasure to finally meet you, after I've heard so much about you. There, towering over them in a polite elegance that only he could manage, was Draco's father. Draco had to fight the urge to run and hide among the crowd of Weasleys, but he knew it was far too late for that. He had been busted. Instead, he stood a little taller, trying for stubborn defiance instead. He could feel the others' eyes on his face as they looked back and forth between his father and him, but he did not meet their eyes, keeping them locked to his father's instead. And look who we have here, his father added, his voice low and dangerous. Fancy meeting you like this, Draco. Draco did not answer, his lips tightening. There was a moment of tense silence before Mr. Weasley appeared behind them, having struggled over towards them with the twins in tow. What are you doing here? He asked them mildly, apparently not having taken note of Draco's father. It's mad in here, let's go outside. Well, Arthur Weasley. His father sneered, a slow smile spreading across his face, the kind that had no warmth in it but was poised with pure malice. It was then that Mr. Weasley looked up at him and his whole composure changed. There was a sudden tension to the way he held himself, and his expression turned almost equally as cold as that of Draco's father. Lucius, he said, nodding once in greeting. Busy time at the ministry, I hear, his father drawled, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly in a way that Draco knew meant an insult was on its way. All those raids. I hope they're paying you overtime. He reached out to pick up one of the books from the Weasley girls' cauldron. Not one of the new ones Harry had dropped there, but an old, better one that was clearly second-hand. His eyebrows rising as he looked at it in distaste. "Obviously not," he answered his own question. "Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace to the name of wizard if they don't even pay you well for it?" "Father!" Draco hissed, anger and humiliation running through him at those words. "Stop! Don't you dare take that tone with me, Draco!" His father snapped, flashing him a sideways look of fury. "You're in enough trouble as it is. Don't make your situation worse by talking back to me." "What are you going to do? Grab me even more?" Draco rolled his eyes, his anger making him braver than he'd usually be. "Throw me in the dungeons?" "I would watch my words if I were you, son," his father ground out. "I have close ties to the headmaster of Durmstrang, you know. It's not too late to take you out of Hogwarts." Draco blanched at that, and his fingers tightened into a fist. "Mother wouldn't let you," he said simply. "Your mother is much too soft with you," he returned coldly, his eyes traveling from Draco to Weasley and finally resting on Hermione, his nose wrinkling in obvious distaste. "Clearly," he stressed. With a dramatic gesture, he dropped the book he was still holding back into the cauldron and turned back to his son. "We're going home," he ordered. "I'm here with Mother," Draco protested. "I can't just disappear. We'll find her and go home together." He was interrupted with a finality that Draco knew he had no chance of winning against. "And then we'll have a good long talk about the company you keep." Draco took a deep breath, glaring back with all the loathing he felt at that moment, before turning back to his friends. Hermione looked slightly shaky, but she was trying to smile at Draco when their eyes met. Weasley looked furious, his face as red as his father's as they both stared up at Lucius Malfoy in barely suppressed rage. Harry looked like he was going to grab Draco's arm and refused to let him leave. "I'll see you on the train," Draco muttered and unwillingly followed his father out of the shop. Draco did not think he had ever seen his father this furious. Their shouting match lasted for almost an hour, only interrupted occasionally by his mother's scorching comments directed at her husband. Draco had been right when saying his mother wasn't going to allow for him to be sent to school halfway across Europe, though it was a close call. Only the threat of her taking Draco packing up and leaving the manor closed that path of his father's argumentation down completely. To say, though, that the rest of Draco's summer holidays was even more hellish than they already had been, was putting it quite mildly. While his father had mainly ignored him for the most part before his trip to Diagon Alley, he now actively searched him out. He punished Draco by giving him work. He was made to read books and essays on blood purity and summarize them to his father after. It was needless to say that these conversations ensured new fights every time. His father might hold the authority to punish him, but Draco was done with letting himself be told what to believe or keeping from voicing his displeasure with his father's bigoted ideas. Every time his father had had enough of what he called Draco's cheek, he'd send him to do physical labor supervised by Dobby, the house elf he used as his personal servant. Draco had polished more family heirlooms or undusted portraits of their horrific ancestors than he could count. One time when he had been especially exhausted, he had asked Dobby to finish the job for him and not tell his father about it. Dobby had done it, but he had punished himself so hard that Draco felt too guilty to try again. His father was also dead set on improving his standing with his fellow pureblood housemates. One afternoon he was called downstairs to find Marcus Flint, a Slytherin sixth-year student and captain of the Quidditch team, sitting in the drawing room with a cup of tea in hand and a very self-satisfied expression on his ugly face. "I had a little chat with Mr. Flint," his father announced the moment Draco entered the room. "You will be playing Seeker for your house team this year." Draco turned to his father, gaping at him, incredulity spreading through him. Of course he had wanted that spot on the team. His father knew he had, but nothing Lucius Malfoy could have done to make sure he received it was going to be to his liking. "Without tryout?" Draco asked flatly. "A tryout would be a mere formality with the son of the team's sponsor among the candidates," He shrugged, taking a sip of his own tea, a pleased smirk on his face. Sponsor! Draco repeated, eyes narrowing. You bumped my way into the team! I merely offered Mr. Flint to provide appropriate rooms to ensure that my son's house had a fair shot at the House Cup this year, he said casually. You can't blame a father for caring, can you, Draco? Draco was furious. He had wanted to try out for the position, but he had wanted to earn it. He was a good flyer, and he was sure if he had been given the chance, he would have made the team. But now he would never know, and he would always be the Malfoy boy that had been bought into the team by his rich father. He was counting the days until school started, and his only glimpses of light were the letters he now received regularly from both Harry and Hermione. Draco suspected they were only writing with such frequency to make sure his father had not murdered him yet, but he appreciated it nonetheless. He refrained from telling Harry about his position on the Quidditch team, though, too ashamed of how he had received it to reveal it, unless he absolutely had to. When September 1st finally rolled around, Draco felt like he had reached the end of a sentence to prison, and his father's mood was even fouler than usual. If I receive one more word of any adventures with your pack of muggle-loving troublemakers, I am going to take you out of school, he threatened in parting. I don't care what your mother says. I'm not going to stand for any more of your behavior. Shame that I don't care what you say, Draco shot back flatly and pushed past him before his father could even reply. His mother took him to King's Cross, thankfully refusing the company of her husband. She even made an effort to converse with Hermione's parents when they came across them, despite the enraged looks she received from the Knots, Crabs, and Goyles, and Draco felt fiercely proud of her. Where were the Weasleys? Draco asked Hermione, looking around anxiously as they neared 11 o'clock. They aren't here yet, are they? I don't think so, Hermione muttered, frowning. They are kind of hard to miss. I hope they're not running late. When it was time to board the train, though, they had spotted neither Harry nor any of the Weasley kids. They decided to search the train, and finally, as they reached the very last wagon, they ran across the twins, sitting with their usual friend and their little sister. There was still no trace, though, of Harry and Weasley himself, though. Have you seen Ron and Harry? Hermione asked as she poked her head into their compartment. Not since we arrived at the station, no. One of the two frowned. Draco could never tell them apart, so he did not even try. We were running late and lost sight of them. We've been searching all over, Draco noted. Maybe you just passed each other. The other one shrugged. Must have, Hermione nodded, but the look she exchanged with Draco was one of confusion. They made their way towards the other side of the train once more, and when they had still not found them, they turned around again in continued search. When they passed the compartment in which Longbottom was sitting alone for the third time, they finally decided to give up and sit with him. Maybe if we stay put, Ron and Harry will find us, Hermione reasoned, though Draco could tell that she didn't believe her own words. He saw his own worry reflected in her brown eyes. I'm telling you, they aren't here, Draco sighed. They have to be somewhere, she insisted. They might have missed the train, Draco pointed out. The twins said they were running late, right? They did, Hermione agreed, biting her lip. What happens if you miss the train? I don't know, Draco shrugged. I think they'll have to contact Dumbledore to get permission for arriving by flu. My granny said I'll have to stay home for the year if I miss the train when she wanted me to hurry earlier, Longbottom interjected, his eyes wide. But maybe she was just saying that to scare me. I'm sure she did, Draco returned skeptically. I can't see Dumbledore refusing anyone attendance just because they missed the train. Harry and Weasley did not show up for the rest of the train ride, or for the way from the station to the school. They were not in the Great Hall for their feast, either, and by the time food appeared on their plates, Draco felt so sick he couldn't get anything down. Where were the two of them? Surely if they had just missed the train, they would have ended up waiting for them at school. Flu traveling was infinitesimally faster than a train ride across the entire country, after all. They'd have had enough time to turn up here while the rest of the students were on their way. So where were they? Draco noticed that at some point Snape picked up McGonagall and Dumbledore and led them out of the hall, something that struck Draco as very odd. The headmaster leaving throughout the welcoming feast? Not something that usually happened, he was sure. He looked over to where Hermione was sitting with Longbottom, and it seemed like she too had noticed and was equally intrigued. It was then that murmurs started to reach his ears. Apparently the car was intended to fly. Crashed right into a tree with it. I hope they get it spelled. With some butter bite. What was that? Draco asked the group of fourth years sitting not far from him sharply. They all looked at Draco as if he was something particularly disgusting found at the sole of their boots, and proceeded to ignore him, acting as if he had not spoken. Draco's entrails seemed to knot themselves into a tight bundle. When Dumbledore, McGonagall, and Snape returned, though, they offered no explanations, though the latter two both looked extremely sour. Dumbledore, though, seemed cheerful as always, and he held his usual speech without a sign of disruption. He then proceeded to send them off to their dormitories, and Draco, still as confused as ever, had no choice but to follow his housemates down to the dungeons. It wasn't until the next morning that he finally came face to face with Harry. Let me get this straight! Draco held up one hand and rubbed his temple with the other, more for the effect of it than to chase away an actual headache. You actually flew that flying car that Mr. Weasley illegally enchanted, for that matter, all the way from London to Hogwarts and crashed it into the Whomping Willow, which almost beat you to death. Yeah, Harry sighed, making a face. It wasn't one of our brightest ideas. I'd say so. Draco shook his head, but he was frowning, curiosity winning over exasperation. But why couldn't you get through to the platform? No idea. Harry shrugged, biting into the sandwich he had snatched before he and Draco had made their way out to the grounds, searching the solitude of a walk for their first real conversation since the last term. But it's weird, isn't it? First the elf and now this. More than weird, Draco frowned. And after a year spent with you, my tolerance for weirdness has increased dramatically, mind you. Harry chuckled, and a comfortable silence fell between them as they strolled by the lake, which was glittering under the brightness of the morning sun. So, how about you? Harry asked, catching Draco's eyes. I see your father let you come back after all. I was kind of afraid he wouldn't. As long as Mother has any say in it, he can't do any real harm. Draco shrugged. I wouldn't put it past her to really back up and leave. Divorce isn't viewed very highly among purebloods, but when it comes down to my happiness, she doesn't really seem to care much about propriety. She's your mother, Harry said very quietly. She wants what's best for you. There was a short moment of silence in which Draco wondered if they should change the subject. Mothers and their love for their sons was a rather touchy subject for Harry, after all. But Harry continued a moment later, a smile returning to his face. Miss Weasley, at least, was outraged by your father's behavior. It seems like Ron's whole family warmed up to you just for standing up to him. That's nice. Draco blinked, surprised. He was beginning to thoroughly review his image of the Weasley family. Weasley himself excluded, of course. No amount of time would make Weasley less bothersome. Draco's first day went by rather calmly. In between classes, homework, and some of the usual taunts from his housemates, he could feel the beginnings of a routine slipping back into place from where it had lain dormant since June. Harry, though, seemed to have had an entirely different return experience. When they met in the library after dinner, he spent most of the time raging about Lockhart in whispered tones, with Hermione looking low-key affronted, and Weasley observing his broken wand with an air of depression. I told you he's an attention-seeking airhead, Draco muttered, absent-mindedly noting down some facts to use for his transfiguration essay. He probably feels threatened by another celebrity in such close proximity. He's a bloody menace, Harry hissed. He's trying to make me seem like the attention-seeking airhead. All I want is to be bloody left alone. I know you do, Draco reassured him. And honestly, everyone at the school who doesn't fancy him will soon know better than to listen to anything he says. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. He's a teacher, you know, Hermione muttered and edged to her voice. You'll need to listen to him if you want to pass your exams. If those are anything like the quiz he gave us today, we can get all answers by regularly reading weekly anyways. Weasley muttered miserably, poking at the spell of tape around the crack in his wand, flinching when red sparks emanated from the tip. Hermione glared at him and buried her face in her herbology book, not speaking to them for the rest of the night. Still, despite especially annoying teachers, and especially grumpy Gryffindors, Draco marveled in the normalcy of it all. It was good to be back at Hogwarts, he decided.